Good day, everyone. Welcome to the Disability Network Zone at the World AIDS Conference 2020. This is the first virtual conference that is being held due to the impact of COVID-19. As ARC, Afrique Rehabilitation and Research Consultants, we are very happy to be able to host the Disability Network Zone. And today we will focus on a very important topic, being gender-based violence and disability. I am happy to be joined with some people who have done quite a bit of research in this field and people who are working with people with disabilities in the field with regards to gender-based violence. I'm going to introduce them. First of all, we are joined by Dr. Professor Jill Hannes-Hancock from the South African Medical Research Council. Jill is a very good friend of mine, and as we have been working together in the disability field for a long time, she is a well-renowned author of numerous articles with regards to disability in different fields, but mainly focused on sexual health and reproductive rights and HIV/AIDS. And she has recently launched a gender-based violence project in Botswana, of which we will hear quite a little bit later. I also want to welcome Sandra Khumalo, also a colleague of mine and a good friend. She is a gold medalist, Olympic athlete. She is a lady that has had an accident and is also in a wheelchair like myself. She's been involved in numerous activities with regards to making people aware of the challenges that people with disabilities are experiencing, and also just living her life as a person with a disability to the amazing extent, and being an example and a peer educator in her community. Thank you very much, Sandra, for joining. Then lastly is Malebogo Molefe. She is from Botswana. Malebogo is also a disability activist. She is also a person with a disability. She has had a spinal cord injury, T23 level, combined with some other levels. I think it's cervical levels as well. It's a tough life for women with disabilities who are experiencing disabilities, especially when it's in the rural areas and that type of thing. And Malebogo has been working in the rural areas, in remote areas in Botswana, changing the lives of people with disabilities and advocacy and leading advocacy for the rights of people with disabilities. She has also recently been awarded the Botswana Chairman Award for excellent work done in the ALIGHT program, and we will also hear a little bit more about that. Hopefully we will be joined by Faustina Urasha from Tanzania. She's also been very involved in peer education of people with disabilities, being a woman with a disability herself. And she will tell us a little bit more about the peer educational programs and the sexual health and reproductive rights program that they have been rolling out in Africa. Let us give Sandra the chance to give us an introduction to what is happening at the moment in the field of gender-based violence in South Africa, and then we will continue. Thank you, Sandra.
Thank you, Jacques, and thank you everyone for having me. It's my first virtual conference and a very exciting topic. that is going on here around, I think worldwide actually, if I cannot just say South Africa. Okay, so say worldwide, women and girls with disabilities are more vulnerable to all forms of violence, including physical, emotional, economic, and sexual violence. The increased vulnerability is linked to double discrimination based on disability. In societies where gender equality and violence against women is endemic, the likelihood of women and girls with disability being victims of violence and therefore even greater. The research from South Africa indicates that up to 51% of women have experienced violence in their lifetime. Violence against women is often based on a negative gender norms and practices contributes to a large extent to the levels of gender-based violence prevalent in the country. In addition, intimate partners violence is one of the most common forms of violence experienced by women. The experience of violence in childhood is often reported as significant risk factor of violence in adulthood, sorry about that. Hence, levels of violence against women and girls are alarmingly high in South Africa. The crime against women in South Africa report that was reported in 2018 also reveals that the murder of women in South Africa is alarmingly high. The report reveals that the prevalence of murder of women was in 2000 like 5 times, and in 2016 it is now double the global average, like 13 to 18 men in from 2013 to 18. And men in South Africa, as Dr. Jacques Lloyd mentioned earlier on, that it's not only women that experience this violence, but also men in South Africa experience high levels of violence. But this is distinctively different from women who are more likely to experience economic and sexual violence. For instance, in the 2016 and 17 victims of crime statistics reported that about 250 out of every 100,000 women were victims of sexual offenses, compared to 120 out of every 100,000 men. In addition, the crime against women in South Africa report reveals that in recent years, people refrain from ordinary daily activities due to fear of crime. Women are more likely to refrain from activities because of fear compared to men, as they feel they are more free to express their sexual orientation or walk to fetch firewood or water, for instance, like in rural areas. Violence against women is driven by negative individuals and social cultural beliefs and practices about gender roles. For instance, the report reveals that in 2016 up to now 20, the report reveals that some women and men still hold negative attitude towards violence against women and find it as acceptable for men to hit a woman if she argues with him, neglects children, or goes without telling him, which is really unacceptable. And also, I think women, we need to speak up when it comes to this. In the last few months, about 20 something women have lost their lives already. And this is scary, South Africa. So South Africa, when are we putting this to an end? Few days back, our South African President Cyril Ramaphosa was on national TV addressing regarding the gender-based violence, and he admitted South Africa is indeed facing a national crisis of violence against women.
Thank you.
I'm going to add on, sorry, I'm just going to add on more about me from what Dr. Jacques Lloyd said. I'm a single paraplegic mom to two very beautiful daughters and I've chosen to live my life peacefully and raise my queens. And I think it's time up as South African women or every African women or globally around the world to speak up when it comes to gender violence. Let's not try and sugarcoat what's happening in our lives or with our partners. It's time that we speak up, because this is at least some of the things that can help to put all this to an end. I'm working very closely with rehabs, as I'm also a national sales rep for gentle catheter that is used by people with disability. And I'm working closely with a lot of people with disabilities around rehabs in South Africa. Thank you so much for your time and allowing me to do this introduction. I'm very honored. And I'll hand it back to Dr. Jacques Lloyd for the next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sandra, for that very informative introduction, and also for sharing some of your personal challenges. We hope to hear a little bit more of that later during the recording of the program. I'm going to give over to Malebogo to talk to us a little bit about what has been happening in Botswana and about the program that they have been actively launching in Botswana. Malebogo, thanks a lot.
Oh, thank you so much for having me in this platform, in this very informative platform. Yes, let me also allude to the fact that I am also a former national basketball. I too have had a fair share of experience of violence. I'm neither different nor special from other women. I share a story of violence that many young women and girls have experienced in all their diversities in Botswana. The synopsis of my story is that I was brutally attacked and shot 8 times by my former partner in 2009. This horrific attack left me fighting for my life and took me a few years to recover from the injuries and the trauma. However, despite the support I received medically, physically, and psychologically, the attack left me with a spinal cord injury, confining me to a wheelchair. Hence now I'm a woman living with disability. I was very fortunate that in 2017, I joined the Allied Botswana project. And this project opened my eyes to the vulnerability of women and girls with disabilities who are at even greater risk of violence. Allied Botswana is a project that focused on increasing participation of women and girls with disabilities in programs that address gender-based violence, SRHR, and HIV in Botswana. At the beginning of the problem, there was no empirical data or any study of violence about women and girls, violence against women, gender, and even there was nothing at all that would reach out or were not accessible to women with disabilities. And also, one of the key areas is that women with disabilities did not know how to reach out into the community for services that address these critical areas. Disabled persons organizations had not identified violence as an issue for their constituency. Most of all women with disabilities were invincible, so it seems. So the first step that Allied was able to achieve was to identify and establish a network of collaborating partners and stakeholders through an inception workshops. This will be all government entities, and NGOs and DPOs, individuals, as well as persons with disabilities. In one of the first activities that we did with Allied was an activism challenge that responded to violence against women, which was during the 16 days of activism, by collecting 100 messages. And one of the messages that really resonated with the project or with the activity was it should go beyond just policies, that we must encourage more conversations to make more people come forward with their experiences, because what is kept in the dark will continue to persist. Additionally, we developed communication tools, including Facebook sites and newsletters, that were able to enable the flow of communication between the NGOs, DPOs, and stakeholders, all of those that we're dealing with in the Allied project. We're also able to identify gaps and opportunities in policy and practice through systematic policy and program review, which was also included in our situation analysis report. We're able to collect and analyze qualitative data and information about the risk of gender-based violence faced by women and girls with disabilities. This was done through case studies, focus group discussions in Gaborone, Greater Gaborone, and Maung and Francistown. This should be 3 areas that we're able to collect information from in depth about, we're able to connect data about the plight of women with disabilities on issues of gender-based violence, gender-based violence, HIV and SRHR. Let me highlight that all this work was done with by women with disabilities, and they were trained to work throughout all of these. That the project really focused on the principle, nothing for them without them. Allied Botswana also provided evidence on the risk factors. And also encouraged NGOs and DPOs and prepared them to increase this participation of women and girls in programs that address them in Botswana. We're able to identify gaps and opportunities to improve disability inclusion in GBV, HR, SRHR, policies and strategies. We then were able to develop a framework for increasing participation of these women in programs that address violence. Through this framework, we developed a training approach for NGOs and DPOs. This is a manual that was compiled together, which is also available at the SAMREC website for further use by those that were trained. Leaders of the 36 NGOs and DPOs was developed and, leaders were trained. Leaders of all these organizations and that formed part of the interviews and the data that was collected were trained with the approach in all the areas, which include Gaborone, Maung, and Francistown. And also the 36 organizations that participated in the Allied project developed evidence-based strategies on how to drive participation and address violence on women and girls with disabilities. And we also came up with an idea and activity such that from all the 36 participating, 6 of these organizations were able, we created a platform where they would present their project ideas and strategies at the last Allied stakeholder meeting to seek potential funding, which was a good thing because then they're able to, the potential sponsors where they are able to assist them in how to attain a sponsorship or funding to mobilize for the project, for their project ideas. In all of this, women with disabilities participated in policy consultations. We're able to form a group of women who were able to present the findings of Alight to Office of the President, and also Alight was picked to participate in the FPA consultations to develop Botswana's new disability strategy. Alight also developed an organization disability audit, which is a checklist that prompts DPOs and all those NGOs that participate to access the inclusion on how they came out of the Alight project. And one of the most important things was the beauties of Alight is that it gave birth to the Malebogo Max wheelchair basketball tournament. Malebogo Max wheelchair basketball tournament married two agendas, one of activism and that of sports. It was aligned to the 16 days of activism, where individuals who are disabled who come for a basketball exhibition, and also have messaging around how they can protect themselves with various stakeholders, and raise awareness on the plight on gender-based violence. And also, through the Alight project, we're able to produce an advocacy song called Jaaka Nna le Wena, and it's in Setswana, which translates to just like me and you. And there are certain elements of success that I need to point out. Alight was able to safely engage in research and project approach, and it was evidence-informed intervention development, which means that evidence from Botswana on disability and violence was collected and analyzed and directly informed the development of a framework which addressed violence against women with disabilities, and to develop the training intervention which I alluded to earlier. Also, it enabled knowledge translation, because a lot of these results were translated into simplified versions and accessible formats, even for persons with disability. Like, for example, those that are blind were able to braille the material so that they're able to access the information that was in all the material. It also enabled participation. The project practiced inclusion and created opportunities for women with disability to participate in all parts of the project. And this was one of the beauties, because all the data was collected by persons with women with disabilities. The data was processed by them, and other activities were done, the presentations with several ministries, and also at High Forum conferences, women with disabilities were able to present about Alight Botswana, which was a real milestone. And also, we appreciate the excellence in science that Alight was able to project. The project team included a very experienced disability researcher, ensuring that the project upholds to high ethical standards and is scientifically robust. And the project also had a very consistent monitoring and evaluation. It effectively planned, and operational processes were used to monitor projects of the process of the project. And one other important area is the accountability of role models. We had very motivated and adaptable team of women with disabilities. To me, I am able to say proudly that Alight Botswana has been a true awakening for Botswana. It literally shone light into the deepest, darkest corner of our beautiful country. It provided rigorous evidence on the risk factors of violence against women and girls with disabilities. It translated study findings into practice. It provided recommendation and advice to policymakers and government, and empowered women with disabilities to have their voices and stories heard. Through those focus group discussions and case study interviews, we're able to gather heart-wrenching experiences of violence by women with disabilities who later were able to pick and participate in the project. I think that the meaningful marriage between the scientists and disability community has been our recipe of success. I would like women with disabilities to be, this is my suggestion, that women with disabilities should be considered more in research and interventions and ensure that they have access to programs that address violence. And now in closing, because this project was a collaborative effort between South African Medical Research Institute in Durban, Botswana Council for Disability in Botswana, as well as Research Institute, also called Institute Management Development in Botswana. I would like to thank the project, also the project funders, USAID, and this Alight team that we work vigorously on and successfully on the project. Most of all, because we worked with a very intelligent researcher. I would like to thank SAMREC for the intervention of this Professor Johannes Hancock. Without her knowledge, we could not have been able to successfully conduct the project. And we thank her for imparting knowledge in Botswana. And I would like to boldly say that with her, I would not be this empowered. All resources and information of the project are available at SAMREC website under Alight Botswana. So everyone is free to go and view these and educate themselves more about Alight Botswana. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. My name is Dr. Jacques Lloyd. I will take this opportunity to enlighten you about the peer educational program that was focused on sexual health and reproductive rights of people with disabilities in Africa. We, unfortunately, Faustina Urasha, who is managing the program, or had been managing the program for many years from Tanzania, is not available at the moment, and due to communicational challenges. This program was started by Motivation Africa, who played a major role in the development of a disability peer training manual for people with spinal cord injuries. The focus was on educating people with spinal cord injuries with regards to various challenges that a person with a spinal cord injury is experiencing or will experience after injury. Things like bladder control, bowel control, but one of the major challenges that people with spinal cord injuries experience is sexual health and reproductive challenges. Because your sexuality is, and your sex, your ability to have normal sexual function is impaired. And this is a situation with men and with women. So the origin of this program was focused basically, firstly, on people with spinal cord injuries. When we realized that there was such a huge need for education with regards to information and the lack of information that led to secondary complications, we also realized that this is not just an isolated situation, but this also has but the sexual reproductive health and the rights aspect also has a huge impact on people with other different disabilities in different ways. But the major challenge that we realized was the fact that people with disabilities are not included within programs when it comes to education. Programs when it comes to education with regards to HIV/AIDS, education with regards to TB, and education with regards to understanding your own disability. And then also when it comes to the fact of receiving psychological support with regards to the psychosocial challenges that people are experiencing who has disabilities. As we have heard earlier, there is a huge challenge when it comes to the abuse of people with disabilities. But there's also a challenge that we came across with regards to the fact that people with disabilities sometimes are desperate when it comes to their sexual exploits and their sexual actions, because they feel that they are left alone. They feel that people think they are asexual, say that they are not sexually active. And sometimes people are exploited for the fact that they are desperate to prove themselves as sexual beings. So within that program, the focus was firstly on educating people with disabilities with regards to the fact that they need to understand their situation. They need to understand their sexual challenges. And we've heard, if you look at the program that Dr. Hannes Hancock has spoken about, Breaking the Silence, that this is a challenge that actually arises at an early childhood level when it comes to abuse, but also at the early childhood youth level when it comes to understanding your disability and understanding the challenges with regards to sexual activities and sexual health and reproductive rights. If we look at where we wanted to go with this, it is basically the same outcomes that we wanted to have as the ones that they have reached with the Alight program. And that is for people with disabilities to become role models and to become peer role models within the community. We have realized that there is no better way than educating people with disabilities and educating them as trainers in how to take the information that they have and transfer and educate other people in the communities. This is very important because we are sitting with a huge challenge of people living in remote areas, and as we said, people not being educated with regards to this. So to end off, the program was rolled out in firstly in Tanzania, then in Uganda, then in Malawi, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, South Africa, so widely in Africa. I'm going to go to Dr. Jill Hannes Hancock to talk to us about the next topic, then we'll go back to Malebogo. Thank you, Jill.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to talk about the Breaking the Silence project, which is one of the projects that we developed to respond to violence against women and girls with disabilities. Okay, so I'm going to share with you some data that led to the development of this program, as well as like how we developed it and what we hope from the future. So this specific program, as I said, it is in response to sexual violence, but also sexuality on and young people with disabilities, in particular young women. And I will just say just now why that is. But before I start, I would like to start with a quote from Anne Finger, which is also the late Paul Chappell's favorite quote about sexuality and disability. And it says, I have to put this down here, okay. Oops. It says, sexuality is often the source of our deepest oppression. It is also often the source of our deepest pain. It's easier for us to talk about and formulate strategies for changing discrimination in employment and education and housing than to talk about our exclusion from sexuality and reproduction. So you can hear these are both persons with disabilities. Paul Chappell has also worked for a very long time in Africa. And you can hear there's something around sexuality and disability that is specifically hidden, not talked about. And as you already have heard from the previous speaker, there is on the other side of the coin, not only sexual violence or gender-based violence, but there is specifically violence against women and girls with disabilities that we're going to explore deeper just now. So, but before I come there, what do we know about young people, and specifically young people with disabilities in Africa? We know some general things around people with disability. We know they make at least 15% of the population, and probably that is larger in Africa. We know that most people with disabilities live in African countries, in low and middle income countries, and that 80%, or like a large portion of those are affected by poverty. We know that the portion of children is smaller because disabilities are also increasing as we age through the time, but we do have very, very little data on young people with disabilities, specifically in adolescents and young people, and specifically here on their sexual reproductive health and right. We understand a few general things about young people with disabilities. We know that they 2 to 8 times more likely to experience violence. I will show a few slides on women with disabilities to that later. We know that they might have lower sexual reproductive health knowledge, and we know that they 2 to 10 times, it always depends which disability group we are talking about, on which country, they're more likely to be not in school. And you can imagine if you're not in school, you're not exposed to a whole number of opportunities. We know that their households occur greater expenses because some of them are disability related, and we know that their households are affected more from poverty. And there's largely spoken about that environment that are inaccessible, that is both in terms of attitudinal, physical, and communication access. And we know that people with disability experience stigma, including those with young people. And in all of that, we know very, very little about sexual reproductive health. But what we do know indicates that young people with disabilities experience like a number of barriers and problems, or challenges, we should say. One of them is, if you look at policies, and many policies now, even in African countries, focus now on young people, but they will forget that there's also young people with disabilities. And if they don't, they may just mention it, but not make meaningful contributions. Just a second. Tandy, I'm recording, you can't make a noise now. Sorry. Sorry, someone is helping me here. So the second thing is, there's we do know that there's endemic levels of physical, emotional, and sexual violence in many countries, but we do also know that specifically there are barriers and risk factors for people with disabilities, in particular women. We know that there are cultural misconceptions about sexuality and disability, and the quote that I had at the beginning alluded to that. One may think people with disabilities are asexual, or that they're not actually, they can't be at risk of anything. Or one may think they have oversex, so specifically sex that speaks to sexual violence. But as you can see from above, people with disabilities are also at risk of physical and emotional violence. There's increased vulnerability to poverty, and both in terms of persons with disabilities and women with disabilities themselves, as well as their households. And there is increasing evidence for that to show how much that gap is. There's certainly a lack of access to sexual reproductive health, rights and service and commodities, and I will show something more about that later. And one of the things that contributes to the whole package of vulnerability of particular young people with disabilities is the lack of comprehensive sexuality education. Okay. So I'm putting like here 4 examples to just give you some more scientific background that also informed where breaking the silence comes from. So one of the things that we do know is that people with disabilities and in low and middle income countries, and that includes Africa, lack access to water, sanitation, hygienic services, and that meet not their needs. That has, by the way, in the recent COVID epidemic, where hand washing is one of the main prevention strategies, it is one of the things that is coming up now. But actually, we know this about people with disabilities for a long time, because particular women with disabilities struggle to access that and need it, particularly when they menstruate. We know they don't have necessarily access to commodities that are needed for during menstruation. And we know that there is stigma around menstruation itself. So the combination of stigma around menstruation and disability and not being able to clean yourself adds additional levels. So this slide was a slide that I talked about earlier. So we know that women with disabilities are at increased risk of violence for quite some time. But in order to produce good science and to quantify this and really make some produce some comparable data, it took some time. But fortunately, we have the What Works program, which is a program that has worked across different low and middle income countries. I have put 2 slides up here that are from African countries. The interesting thing about this program is that it has shown how women in general experience intimate partner violence. And it has included disability indicators, so we could see how women with disabilities are affected. So one of the things that we can say that from this very rigorous data is that women and girls with disability are 2 to 4 times more likely to experience intimate partner violence. But we can also see that the severity of disability matters. So the more severe the disability, a person's disability is, the greater the likelihood of experience violence. We also have seen in the HIV space attempts to measure how people with disabilities and women with disabilities in particular are affected by HIV infection. That took actually some decades to get some really good data, because again, disability indicators are usually forgotten in these kind of surveys that assess HIV prevalence. And only in recent years there have been a slight increase, but the main data that we actually get here is from disability specific studies. And all of these studies show the same trend. There is a little bit of a suggestion that people with disabilities might be at higher risk of HIV infection, but the data isn't clear. It becomes clear when one puts the gender aspect in there. We see that it's actually women with disabilities who are specifically at risk of HIV infection. And we also have some really nice work now from the Baude Cup in several African countries, which suggests that some of the risk factors are the common ones that we know: poverty, lack of education, lack of information, access to services. But for women with disability, the increased risk compared to women without disabilities actually associated to increased exposure to sexual violence and use of transactional sex. The later is connected to poverty. So we can see that sexual violence is one of the predominant experiences for women with disabilities that are also slightly different and more enhanced than in women without disabilities. So there's a question of where that comes from. Some of it comes obviously from marginalization of women with disabilities, but some of it comes also from a lack of being exposed to the right information and learning the right skills to defend yourself against violence of any form, including sexual violence. So we have looked in at, okay, do young people with disabilities have access to comprehensive sexuality education? And over the years, the data is always the same, suggesting it's the same trend. Children with disabilities are disproportionately part of those that are out of school. And you can imagine if you're out of school, you're also less likely to receive sexuality education and any kind of skills that are life skills that you need, including comprehensive sexuality education. So there's strong evidence for that. There's also very little data, particularly in Africa, then looking at, okay, of those ones that are at school, which ones are having access to sexuality education? We have actually no quantitative data, but we do have some when we can look for instance, in US studies, and these studies are suggesting that people with disabilities, or young people, are less likely to, even if they're at school, to receive sexuality education. You can see some numbers there, which is all about less than half of the people with disabilities in school get access to sexuality education. We have from Africa, we have some qualitative studies that suggest the same thing. And these qualitative studies have also assessed how teachers, okay, these have also suggested how teachers feel about sexuality education and how they provide it. And some of the things that we found in our own study, which you see just now, is that the lack of sexuality education isn't just a matter of bad attitude or not wanting to educate. It's also a matter of, I don't know how to do it. I don't have the skills, I don't have the tools, I don't know how to do it, because providing sexuality education in itself is challenging, specific in cultural contexts where that is a taboo. But it is even more challenging when one needs to provide that in accessible formats, which may be like really visual and be more difficult to provide when you haven't been trained on how to do it. Okay, so now what is Breaking the Silence about? So first of all, Breaking the Silence is an evidence-based curriculum implementation approach that draws on social learning theory and utilizes group-based learning through participatory methods. It's a whole school approach, so it isn't just the teachers, it is also social workers, psychologists, drivers, caregivers, or even peers and parents are important to deliver that. And it is based on two specific bigger aspects. One is it to enable educators and to provide accessible, comprehensive sexuality education. That means that their skills are being trained and that they're getting tools to do so. The other part is that we're trying to stimulate normative change to overcome personal as well as community-driven social and cultural barriers based on both gender, sexuality, and on disability and sexuality. Now, when we developed this approach, we did that in several phases with small little pockets of money here and there, but like a lot of voluntary work. And you can see that we started originally with a literature review and with stakeholder engagement. And this particular stakeholder engagement included people with disabilities who specifically pointed out the need for sexuality education. We then conducted a survey and focus group discussions with teachers to understand their attitudes, knowledge about comprehensive sexuality education in the context of a disability, as well as their concerns and needs in order to provide better education in this area. Based on all of that, we developed an intervention that is called Breaking the Silence, and it included not only researchers like myself, it also included people with disabilities and educators and the Department of Education in South Africa. So it was originally aligned directly with the South African Life Orientation curriculum, which has currently undergone a revamp, and I will say something to that just now. But with that specific intervention that we had there in 2013, we conducted a pilot informative evaluation with 100 teachers. And that included a survey and other focus group discussion afterwards, and in order to better understand the implementation, the challenges as well as opportunities. After that, and that is over the last 2 years, we have aligned with Breaking the Silence with the UN technical guidelines on comprehensive sexuality education. That is the same technical guidelines that the South African curriculum has been aligned with recently as well. And many other African countries are using that. So what did our needs assessment show? Our needs assessment originally showed that educators in South Africa identified sexuality education for learners as important. So before that, the literature that we had indicated that they don't necessarily see it as important for them, but that actually had changed already in 2012-13 in South Africa, and that is probably also due to the awareness of the importance of sexuality education because of the local HIV epidemic. But educators specifically pointed out they lack skills to provide CSE in general, but for people with disabilities in particular how to do that in accessible formats for different types of disabilities, for learners that are blind, for learners that are deaf, for learners with physical disabilities, and for learners with intellectual disabilities. And all of them, those learners have different learning needs, and they need any material for learning is packaged in a specific way that is accessible to with their disability. And that also applies for comprehensive sexuality education. Apart from that, I also needed guidance into how far can I go? Like, am I allowed to talk about difficult subjects such as, let's say, masturbation? We have found that, for instance, that teachers told us that's what they have experience in their school and they don't know how to handle it. So are they allowed to talk about it? Because on the other side of the coin, there are culture, but also individual taboos and challenges to talk about things like that. And we found that educators in general approach sexuality education from a protective discourse. So not from a human rights discourse or from a discourse of enabling the right to enjoy your sexual and reproductive health and rights on an equal basis with others. It was on protecting of learners from, specifically from sexual violence and exploitation. So this is the whole Breaking the Silence approach altogether. So over the years, we have developed like 5 components. This has a whole conceptual framework with it, which I already spoke to. It's a whole inclusive school approach. It's an inclusive approach. So you can use Breaking the Silence in any kind of school, including any type of special school. It is comprehensive. It is human rights based. So it is not, it's trying to shift the protective approach that teachers have towards a human rights based approach. And it is evidence based. So it's not just what came into our mind, it is what is important to teachers in order to be able to provide comprehensive sexuality education. It includes a training for teachers, which is a 3-day training, and tools that are being given to teachers to include. And these tools is a complete toolkit that now has pictures, translation of pictures for blind people in terms of Braille and audio. It has also 12 essential lessons, and it has many worksheets and work plans that a teacher can use. It also has a specific facilitator manual, so you could use this kind of intervention to train the trainers and bring it into other African countries, into other settings. that are far beyond what a small group of inventors of this intervention can do. And it has a whole research and knowledge generation component, so it is possible to use deep breaking the silence research tools to do feasibility, acceptability, and validation studies. It also includes a checklist for healthcare services to check if the healthcare services that are connected to your specific school are prepared to actually take the learners that now maybe have received comprehensive sexuality education, that are now asking for condoms, for contraceptives, for referrals because if they have experienced sexual violence and the like. Yeah, so that is in breaking the silence in a nutshell. As I said, we have piloted with that with 100 teachers, and I give you some of the feedback of what came from these teachers after they've been trained and tried for 3 to 6 months to implement this program. So one of the things we found is that it's extremely important that it is a whole school approach. So that is something that not necessarily like every Department of Education is enabling you to do. So often we had the experience that only 2 or 3 teachers were allowed to be trained at a time from a school, and that mass is very small when these teachers go back into a school where the culture and the sensitivity around comprehensive sexuality education is not prepared for change yet. So we found that that is one of the important things. The teachers said, but from what they were able to implement, teachers told us that they saw changes in their learners' knowledge about sexuality, their attitudes and beliefs. Also some of the sexual activities that teachers found inappropriate in the classroom, they were able to change. So I had already talked about the masturbation aspect. So it really enabled teachers to take to work with these kind of expressions and put them in the right context and teach learners where to do that in a safe but also in an appropriate way. They found it enabled learners to speak about their sexuality, but also about their experiences and to report when things, including harassment or sexual abuse, where if they experience that. They shared some of the challenges that they had, and a lot of the challenges related to implementing breaking the silence, probably in the same way as any comprehensive sexuality education approach, is the context. So it is your peers. How do the peers view you when you start talking about everything in a very open way? So again, like soft topics, we call them like that, such as training assertiveness skills, saying yes and no. They were easy to implement for teachers. There were topics that were closer to sexual intercourse or sexual expressions, such as, let's say, homosexuality, were much more difficult for educators to implement if they had other educators around who would be conservative or restricting, we should probably rather say, perceptions of sexuality and disability. And then there were some personal factors. And this is, again, we're talking here in the context of South Africa. So for some educators, particular women, it was very difficult to talk, to change their shift from a protective to a human rights approach, because their own experience around sexuality is not necessarily positive. So it is very difficult to say, you know, sexuality is something that you will experience when you're an adult with whom you want to. It can be a pleasurable thing, and not just don't do X, Y, Z, protect yourself. It is difficult when you haven't experienced that yourself to then teach that to your learners, with or without disabilities. But all of them found very, very helpful is the tools that they were provided with, because we're working on breaking the silence with distancing tools. So you there in the picture, you see, for instance, a picture of a man, maybe where you can take off and put on the genital area and other areas. you also, you can't see it very well, Rebecca there is holding a sequence, a story. In this case, it is around what is a wet dream. So distancing techniques allows you to talk to a picture in this case, or to a story or an audio that you're hearing, rather than having a personal interaction about really tricky topics. And these things help teachers to talk about it, but in the way these pictures here are presented, they also simplify issues. So for learners with intellectual disabilities, they're extremely helpful, and for deaf learners, pictures are extremely helpful. While for learners that are blind, we have produced these same kind of materials, but in a more tactile way. These things are also not very, we have also, it took us a long time to produce material that is not pornographic and that is able to be accepted and to be produced in a classroom. So that is the things that the teachers were found particularly helpful. Yeah. So now I have a few publications here that we have done on breaking the silence. I'm sure you can download some of them. And I do think that maybe at the end here, I will have to say this year, we're hoping really that together with UNFPA and other NGOs, we will be able to test how feasible it is to implement breaking the silence in South African schools. And that will hopefully enable many, many other people to take breaking the silence up and make it available to people to use. Thank you.
Unfortunately, we have a limited time left. In closing, I think that it is very important for us to acknowledge that people, able-bodied people, are not going to change the situation that people with disabilities are in. Programs like this, the LIGHT program, the peer support program, are there to educate people with disabilities, to take responsibility for their own actions, to understand the challenges and to understand what they need to do to change the environment around them and to change the way people look at them and to stand up for their rights as people and not just as people with disabilities. For more information, you can access the website of ARC, Africa Rehabilitation and Research Consultants, and there is more information on the site with regards to the program and the rollout and support of the program. I just want to, first of all, lift my hat to Malebogo for the excellent way that she has stood up from what happened to her and became a role model. This is the type of outcome that we are looking for in the field. Secondly, I want to say that we need to start focusing on the elderly, because they are also, the elderly with disability are also abused, are also neglected. We need to focus on women, youth, children, and men and boys. Boys with disabilities, it's a huge challenge. Secondly, the success stories here, you need to go and look into the success stories, and we need to build on those success stories. The basketball awareness message and the song that they have done, inclusion of people with this, women with disabilities to become role models, and also the evidence-based outcomes that enforce change in research areas and in government structures. Thank you very much for joining the session, and I hope that this will also mean as much to you as it meant to me.